The Zodiac Killer remains one of the most notorious and elusive figures in American crime history. Operating in Northern California during the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Zodiac Killer claimed responsibility for at least 5 confirmed murders, though he alleged that his total body count was far higher. What makes the Zodiac case particularly chilling is not only the brutality of the crimes, but also the killer's relentless taunting of law enforcement and the media through a series of cryptic letters and ciphers, most of which have never been solved. The first murders widely linked to the Zodiac Killer occurred on December 20th, 1968, when high school students Betty Lou Jensen and David Arthur Faraday were shot. At just 16 years old, Jensen was a student at Hogan High School, while 17-year-old Faraday attended Vallejo High School. It was a Friday, 5 days before Christmas, and the small town of Vallejo was winding down for the holiday season. That evening, Faraday picked up Jensen in his mother's car at 8 p.m, and the couple set out around 8:30 to visit one of Jensen's friends. After spending some time together, they drove to a secluded area on Lake Herman Road, just inside the city limits of Benicia, where they parked around 9 p.m. A passing motorist spotted the couple between 10:15 and 10:30 p.m, parked on the gravel runoff next to the gate of a water pumping station. They were seen again at 11 p.m. The attack occurred between 11:05 and 11:10 p.m. Investigators determined that an unknown assailant, later identified as the Zodiac, pulled his vehicle alongside Faraday's car, roughly 10 feet from the passenger side. Exiting his car, he approached the couple and began firing shots into their vehicle. The initial shots struck various parts of the car, but did not hit Jensen or Faraday, and it is believed he may have been trying to force them out. Both teenagers attempted to escape through the passenger door, Jensen managing to get out first. As Faraday was also attempting to exit, the Zodiac shot him in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The assailant then chased Jensen, firing 6 shots and striking her in the back 5 times before fleeing the scene. Police later theorized that the entire attack lasted just 2 to 3 minutes. The precision of the shots, especially given the darkness and the panic of the situation, indicated that the killer was a skilled marksman. There were no signs of robbery or sexual assault, and the only possible motive seemed to be sheer, cold-blooded murder. A motorist discovered the couple's bodies at 11:10 p.m. and promptly flagged down a police patrol car to report the incident. Officers arrived at the scene, where they pronounced Jensen dead, while Faraday, still alive, was rushed to the hospital, but later succumbed to his injuries. Authorities found no usable tire or footprint evidence left by the assailant, and no witnesses came forward. With no apparent motive other than the possibility that the killer was a madman, an intensive investigation followed, yet no viable suspects emerged. The media extensively covered the murders, which would become the catalyst for the Zodiac's subsequent notoriety. After this brutal attack, there was no confirmed activity from the Zodiac for 7 months, a period that authors Michael Kelleher and David Van Nuys described as a potential cooling-off period. This is typical among many serial killers who need time to reflect on their actions. This double homicide left local police puzzled. The couple had no known enemies, and there was no obvious motive for the crime. Police had few leads, other than the fact that the killer must have used a flashlight to navigate the scene and aim accurately. There were some tire tracks found near the scene, but they were never conclusively linked to any vehicle. In retrospect, this murder was an introduction to the Zodiac's signature methods. He struck in isolated locations, targeted young couples, and killed swiftly and efficiently. Though police worked tirelessly on the case, they could not have predicted that this was just the beginning of a larger and more sinister series of crimes. On the night of July 4th, 1969, Vallejo was alive with fireworks and celebrations. Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau were shot around midnight. Ferrin, aged 22, was a well-liked member of the community due to her job at a local restaurant, where she met 19-year-old Mageau. Despite being married to Dean Ferrin at the time, Darlene and Michael decided to go on a date that evening. After receiving a phone call at her home around 11:30 p.m, presumably from Mageau, she left and arrived at his house by 11:50. Details surrounding the case became murky, filled with conflicting statements and speculation. According to Zodiac researcher Robert Graysmith, shortly after leaving Mageau's house, the couple believed they were being followed by a man in a light-coloured car. Just before midnight, she turned into the deserted parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park, another popular spot for couples located 2 miles from Lake Herman Road. She parked approximately 70 feet from the entrance, and soon after, another vehicle pulled in around 80 feet to her left. The unknown driver, later identified as the Zodiac, turned off his headlights and sat silently at the wheel. Mageau inquired about the driver, but Ferrin reassured him not to worry. About 5 minutes later, the Zodiac returned, parking next to Ferrin's vehicle on the passenger side. Exiting his car, he approached theirs and shone a flashlight inside. Assuming he was a police officer, the couple rolled down their window. Instead of speaking, the man fired a 9mm pistol into the car. One bullet struck Mageau in the right arm, while another hit Ferrin in the neck, causing her to slump toward the steering wheel and lose consciousness. In a panic, Mageau attempted to escape, but the passenger door handle was either missing or removed. After stepping away from Ferrin's car, the Zodiac returned to his own vehicle, but instead of leaving, he opened the car door and did something that Mageau couldn't see. Observing Mageau struggling to exit, the Zodiac quickly approached again, firing 4 more shots, 2 at each person, before returning to his car and speeding away. The caretaker of a nearby golf course heard the commotion and estimated that the incident occurred around 12:10 a.m. The Zodiac left behind no evidence that could link him to the crime. After the shooting, 3 teenagers arrived at the parking lot and discovered the injured couple. They left to seek help, and police arrived on the scene by 12:20 a.m. While Mageau was taken to the hospital, Ferrin was pronounced dead at 12:40. Mageau described his attacker as a heavy-set white man, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighing between 195 and 200 pounds, with short, curly, light brown hair and a potbelly. He was dressed in dark clothing and did not wear glasses, but this description was insufficient to develop a viable suspect. Shortly after Ferrin's death, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call from a public telephone within 2 blocks of their location. The caller, identifying himself as the killer, stated, "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." The relationship between Ferrin and the Zodiac had been a subject of controversy. Authors Kelleher and Nyes suggested that theories of a prior connection began with Robert Graysmith's book Zodiac, where he argued for a link based on anecdotes from Ferrin's friends. However, this argument largely rested on speculation, with no conclusive evidence to support it. At the hospital, Mageau claimed not to know his assailant, with varying reports suggesting he was uncertain if Ferrin knew him, or that she did know him and referred to him as Richard. Interestingly, Ferrin's sister later claimed one of Darlene's boyfriends was named Richard. In the Zodiac's later communications, he consistently referred to Ferrin simply as girl. The locations of this known attack could indicate he targeted Ferrin and Mageau due to the secluded nature of the area. Kelleher and Nyes speculate that the couple may have been followed after leaving Mageau's house, suggesting a deeper connection between Ferrin and the Zodiac. Kelleher and Nyes argue that Ferrin's calm reassurance to Mageau and their assumption that the Zodiac was a police officer was more likely if they were not being pursued. Ferrin was acquainted with Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, having attended Hogan High School, which was near Lake Herman Road. In 2010, a photograph surfaced showing Ferrin with an unidentified man resembling the composite sketch of the Zodiac. Police indicated that this image might have been taken in San Francisco around 1966 or 1967, adding another layer of intrigue to the mystery surrounding Ferrin's tragic fate. Lake Berryessa, located in Napa County, was a popular destination for locals seeking relaxation and recreation. On September 27, 1969, Brian Hartnell, who was 20, and Cecilia Shepard, who was 22, were enjoying a warm sunny afternoon by the lake, lounging on a blanket under a tree near the water's edge. It was an idyllic scene until the Zodiac arrived. As the couple relaxed by the lake, a man suddenly approached them wearing an executioner-style hood that concealed his face. His outfit included clip-on sunglasses and a bib-like section of cloth emblazoned with the Zodiac's now infamous crosshair symbol. He held a gun which he later claimed was a .45 caliber and told the couple that he had just escaped from a prison and needed their money and car keys to get to Mexico. Hartnell and Shepard, terrified but compliant, handed over their keys and some money. The killer then ordered Hartnell to lie face down, where he proceeded to bind both victims' hands and feet with pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. Once the couple were immobilized, the attacker pulled out a long knife and began stabbing them viciously. Hartnell was stabbed 6 times in the back, while Shepard was stabbed 10 times. After the attack, the Zodiac walked calmly back to Hartnell's car, where he scrawled a message on the door using a black felt-tip pen. The message was a number of dates, including the words Vallejo and knife. It was a taunting reference to the previous murders and a brazen admission of guilt, complete with the Zodiac symbol underneath the writing. At 7:40 p.m., approximately an hour after the attack, a man phoned the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone in downtown Napa. He calmly stated, "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia." Once again, the call was traced to a payphone, but no substantial leads were found. KVON radio reporter Pat Stanley discovered the phone a few minutes later, still off the hook. It was located just a few blocks from the sheriff's office, approximately 27 miles from the crime scene. Detectives managed to lift a still wet palm print from the phone, but they were unable to match it to any known suspect. After hearing the victim's cries for help, a man and his son, who were fishing in a nearby cove, found Hartnell and Shepard and contacted park rangers for assistance. Napa County deputies Dave Collins and Ray Land were the first law enforcement officers to reach the scene. When Collins arrived, Shepard was conscious and provided him with a detailed description of their attacker. Both she and Hartnell were then transported by ambulance to the Queen of the Valley Hospital in Napa. Unfortunately, Shepard fell into a coma during the journey and never regained consciousness, passing away in the hospital 2 days later. Hartnell, on the other hand, survived and later shared his story with the press.
The only thing to me, this came out since then, but he told me at that time that he had killed a guard getting out of a prison. And so I did take him as a killer. To me, a killer isn't a normal person, so I assumed at the time that something was wrong. But as far as a psychopath or any other aberration, I really didn't realize at the moment. I wasn't concerned because I was cooperating with him, and I expected that he would cooperate with me. And I tried to be as accommodating under the circumstances as possible to save the girl, any harm. He wanted our money. And I actually laughed at the moment because I told him, I says, I've only got 75 cents in my pocket. And I says, you're welcome to have it. But if you need help, I'm sure I can give you help otherwise. And I asked him what his problem was. And he mentioned that he was a convict trying to get to Mexico and needed money and transportation. And I offered him assistance. I told him what I was doing in school and that if I could be of any assistance whatsoever, I offered him my phone number, anything like this, and this just isn't what he wanted. He said he wanted money, and I was really sorry. I said, you got to check if I'd really like to help you, if you would be willing to accept help. He said, well, what I need right now is to get you tied up.
Unlike the Zodiac's previous victims, Paul Stine, who was 29, was not a young couple enjoying a night out. He was a cab driver working in San Francisco, far from the remote locations that had previously defined the Zodiac's attacks. On the evening of October 11, 1969, Stine picked up a fare at the intersection of Mason and Geary Streets in San Francisco's bustling downtown area. The passenger requested to be taken to the affluent Presidio Heights neighborhood. When they arrived at the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger pulled out a 9mm handgun and shot Stine once in the head. The killer then calmly removed a piece of Stine's blood-stained shirt, wiped down the cab fingerprints, and casually walked away, blending into the neighborhood. 3 teenagers across the street witnessed the incident and called the San Francisco police. They described the suspect as a husky white man, wearing a dark or black jacket. However, due to a mistake by the dispatcher, police were incorrectly informed that the suspect was a black man. The witnesses also observed the killer cleaning the cab and seemingly rifling through the victim's clothing. As he leaned inside the cab to tidy up, he left partial fingerprints from 2 fingers on his right hand. 2 blocks away from the crime scene, patrol officers responded to the radio dispatch and arrived at the intersection of Washington and Cherry just 2 minutes later. They spotted a white male in dark clothing walking north, away from the crime scene and toward the Presidio Army base. This individual may have been the Zodiac. When the officers pulled up alongside him and inquired if he had seen anything suspicious, he replied that he had seen a man waving a gun earlier, and mentioned that the suspect had gone east down Washington. The officers then drove away quickly, mistakenly believing that a black man was the culprit, but perhaps they had just spoken to Zodiac himself. Shortly after, as more police arrived at the scene, Stein was pronounced dead, prompting a search of the surrounding area, including the Presidio. By that point, the Zodiac had likely escaped, possibly getting into a parked car and driving across the Golden Gate Bridge. Initially, the murder of Stein was thought to be a routine robbery that had escalated into a violent attack. However, on October 13th, the San Francisco Chronicle received a new letter from the Zodiac, who claimed responsibility of the killing and included a torn piece of Stein's bloody shirt as proof. The letter also contained a threat to kill school children on a school bus, prompting Bay Area police departments to start escorting school buses for added safety. In the days following the murder, the responding officers realized they had likely spoken to the Zodiac, and later assisted in creating a composite sketch of the suspect, along with the teenage witnesses. The Zodiac Killer's letters and ciphers stand out as one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. He started his letters with "This is the Zodiac speaking," and signed them with a symbol resembling the crosshairs of a gun sight. His cryptic messages, filled with bizarre symbols and eerie taunts, offered both clues and misdirection to law enforcement and the public. These ciphers were designed to challenge investigators while feeding the killer's need for attention and control. Over the years, they have become one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in criminal history, with only some of the ciphers having been cracked. The Zodiac Killer sent 4 main ciphers. He used these ciphers to both taunt and toy with authorities, showcasing his intelligence and his twisted desire to gain notoriety. In August 1969, just a month after the second Zodiac attack, 3 nearly identical letters were mailed to 3 Bay Area newspapers: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Each letter began with a boastful declaration: "I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman." The writer also included specific details about the murders that had not been released to the public, lending credibility to his claim. The 408 character cipher was split into 3 sections, one sent to each newspaper. It consisted of 54 rows of symbols, each containing 17 characters, making it a daunting puzzle for authorities and the public. The cipher was a series of symbols, including circles, triangles, and various shapes that appeared nonsensical at first glance. Cryptographers and amateur sleuths alike scrambled to solve the puzzle. The Zodiac's challenge ignited public fascination, with many trying their hand at decoding it. The San Francisco Chronicle ran the cipher as requested, and the race to crack it began. After several days of work, the cipher was finally solved by a high school teacher, Donald Hardin, and his wife, Betty Hardin. The Hardin couple's solution to the cipher revealed the chilling message, written in broken English and filled with misspellings. While the message did not provide the killer's identity, despite his implied threat in the letter, it instead revealed a disturbing insight into his psyche. It read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all to kill. Something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all the victims I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." This chilling message spoke to the Zodiac's disturbed sense of superiority and sadism. His comparison of human life to hunting, and his apparent belief in an afterlife where his victims would become his slaves, hinted at delusions of grandeur and a sociopathic mindset. However, the most significant part of the cipher, his identity, was notably absent. Instead, the killer made it clear that revealing his name would interfere with his plans. The successful decryption of the 408 character cipher was a major breakthrough, but it ultimately raised more questions than answers. It showcased the Zodiac's thirst for attention and his desire to manipulate and control the narrative surrounding his crimes. On November 8, 1969, the Zodiac sent another cryptic puzzle to the San Francisco Chronicle, this time in the form of a 340-character cipher, known as Z340. This cipher contained 20 rows of symbols, each 17 characters wide. Unlike the previous 408-character cipher, Z340 has proven far more complex and resisted attempts at decryption for over 5 decades. It wasn't until December 2020, more than 51 years after it was sent, that Z340 was finally cracked by a team of 3 cryptographers. Using a combination of human intuition and computer software, they discovered the method behind the cipher, revealing the hidden message. It read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise. So they're afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death." Much like the 408 character cipher, this message revealed the Zodiac's fixation on a delusional paradise where his victims would serve him in the afterlife. It also referenced his appearance on TV, likely alluding to an October 1969 television broadcast where a man claiming to be the Zodiac had called into a live show. However, the most tantalizing question remained unanswered. Who was he? On April 20th, 1970, the Zodiac sent another letter to the San Francisco Chronicle. This time, the message contained a 13-character cipher that has since been dubbed the "My Name Is" cipher, due to its cryptic promise to reveal his name. The letter also included a drawing of a crosshair symbol and the Zodiac's now famous signature. The letter was short, but it hinted at what many believed was the key to the case, the killer's real identity. The cipher was much smaller than the others, with only 13 symbols, but despite its brevity, it has resisted decryption efforts for over 50 years. The 13-character cipher contains the following symbols. The simplicity of the cipher led many to believe it could be solved quickly, but it proved to be surprisingly difficult. Some cryptologists speculated that the cipher was too short to solve, or that the Zodiac had used it as another ploy to mislead authorities. It remains unsolved to this day, with the promise of revealing the killer's name still unfulfilled. On June 26, 1970, the Zodiac mailed yet another letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, this time with a 32-character cipher known as Z32. The letter threatened that the killer had planted a bomb set to go off and kill schoolchildren. This chilling claim sent waves of panic through the community, though no bomb was ever found. The letter was accompanied by a cipher and a map that pointed to the supposed bomb's location. The Zodiac wrote, "P.S. The Mount Diablo code concerns radians, plus #inches along the radians." This cryptic reference suggested that the solution to the cipher was tied to a measurement involving angles and distances on a map. The Z32 cipher has stumped investigators and amateur cryptographers alike. Various theories have emerged regarding the use of radians, which is a unit of angular measurement, in relation to the map, but no definitive solution has been found. Without the key to cracking the code, the threat of the bomb remained uncertain, though most experts believe the Zodiac was merely bluffing to stir fear. The Zodiac Killer's use of ciphers to taunt the police and the public remains one of the most intriguing elements of his reign of terror. Despite decades of effort and some success in solving his puzzles, the most tantalizing aspects of his cryptic communications, particularly the revelation of his identity, remain hidden. These complex cryptograms not only underscore the Zodiac Killer's arrogance and obsession with playing a game, but also continue to fuel the mystery that has kept the case alive for decades. Even as some of his ciphers have been decoded, others remain unbroken, leaving a part of the Zodiac's chilling legacy buried in mystery. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Zodiac case is the minimal amount of physical evidence left behind at the crime scenes. Despite the brutal nature of the Zodiac's attacks, which involved both shootings and stabbings, the killer was careful not to leave much behind that could be traced back to him. The investigation has been hampered by a lack of clear forensic evidence, particularly in the early days when techniques like DNA analysis were still decades away from development. However, over the years, several pieces of evidence were recovered from the crime scenes, and some of it has been revisited with modern forensic techniques. The attack at Blue Rock Springs Park resulted in the death of Darlene Ferrin and the serious wounding of Michael Mageau. This second Zodiac attack was significant for a few reasons. It was a drive-by shooting where the killer approached the parked vehicle in a remote Lover's Lane spot and fired multiple shots through the windows. Investigators found several 9mm shell casings at the scene, which indicated that the gun used was a semi-automatic pistol. Michael Mageau, though critically wounded, survived the attack and later gave descriptions of the shooter. Mageau described the assailant as a white male, approximately 5'8" to 6 feet tall, a stocky build and wearing dark clothing. His testimony was one of a few eyewitness accounts of the Zodiac Killer, but it didn't provide enough detail for a clear identification. The first confirmed Zodiac killings occurred at Lake Herman Road, where high school students Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were murdered. Unlike the later crimes, this attack was notable for its sudden and brutal nature, with little interaction between the killer and the victims. Shell casings from a .22 caliber long rifle were recovered from the scene, establishing that the Zodiac used a different firearm for this attack compared to later ones. Tire impressions were found at the scene, which led investigators to conclude that the killer's car had been parked behind the victim's vehicle. The tire tracks were carefully documented, but due to a lack of detailed information about the exact make and model of the car, this lead did not result in an arrest. The evidence has since been revisited, but it hasn't been conclusive enough to single out a suspect. Investigators discovered footprints leading away from the crime scene that indicated the killer had approached on foot after parking his car. However, no significant conclusions were drawn from the footprints, and they weren't detailed enough to provide a useful clue. The Lake Berryessa attack was the Zodiac's most unusual crime in terms of his interaction with the victims. Unlike the previous shootings, this attack involved a knife, and the killer wore a hooded costume and directly confronted Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard before stabbing them. Hartnell survived the attack, providing a detailed description of the killer's costume and behavior. After the attack, the Zodiac walked to Brian Hartnell's car and wrote a message on the door with a felt-tip pen. The message included the Zodiac symbol, which is a circle with a cross, the dates of the Zodiac's previous crimes, and the time of the current attack. This marked the first time the Zodiac explicitly referenced his earlier murders at a crime scene. Handwriting analysis was later conducted on this message, but it didn't definitively match any known suspects. The most distinctive element of this attack was the Zodiac's costume. He wore a black executioner-style hood with the Zodiac symbol emblazoned on his chest. He also wielded a knife that was used to stab the victims. No physical trace of the costume or the knife was ever found, making it difficult for investigators to follow up on this unusual and chilling element. Investigators found more footprints at this scene as well that indicated the killer walked from the attack site to Hartnell's car. These prints were consistent with size 10.5 Wing Walker military-style boots, a lead that investigators followed but were unable to conclusively tie to any particular suspect. Brian Hartnell survived the attack and provided a detailed account of the killer's behavior and appearance and the chilling conversation that took place before the stabbing. Hartnell's description of the Zodiac's mannerisms helped investigators better understand the psychology of the killer, but it did not yield enough to lead to a definitive identification. The murder of San Francisco taxi driver Paul Stine marked a departure from the Zodiac's previous patterns. Stine was shot in the head at point-blank range, and the killer did not target a couple in a remote area, but instead committed the crime in a populated urban setting. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the Stine murder came from eyewitnesses who saw the Zodiac flee the scene. 3 teenagers observed the killer from a window and later described him to the police as a white male, 25 to 30 years old, with a heavy build, reddish-brown hair, and glasses. This description led to the famous Zodiac composite sketch that has been used for decades as a potential likeness of the killer. The Zodiac took Paul Stine's wallet and keys, but left behind several key pieces of evidence. Notably, he tore off a portion of Stine's bloody shirt and sent it to the San Francisco Chronicle in a taunting letter to prove that he was the killer. This piece of fabric has been preserved, and investigators have tested it in the hopes of retrieving trace DNA. Investigators recovered a bloody fingerprint from the taxi's door handle, which was believed to belong to the killer. However, the print was of poor quality, and despite being one of the few pieces of tangible evidence, it has not been conclusively matched to any known suspects. Some experts have suggested that the print could have come from someone other than the Zodiac, or was smudged in a way that makes it difficult to use for comparison. The Zodiac's letters were subjected to extensive handwriting analysis, but results have been inconclusive. Handwriting experts compared the Zodiac's writing to several suspects, including Arthur Leigh Allen and Lawrence Kane, but no definitive match has ever been made. The Zodiac's tendency to vary his handwriting and use both printed and cursive styles has made it difficult for investigators to draw firm conclusions. In the late 90s and early 2000s, advancements in forensic science allowed investigators to attempt DNA extraction from the stamps and envelopes used in the Zodiac's letters. Partial DNA profiles were recovered from some of the letters, but they have not been conclusively linked to any of the suspects. DNA from the back of the stamps, which is the licked part, was unusable, but a partial DNA profile was taken from the front of the stamps, but it did not lead to a positive identification of the Zodiac. It is possible that the DNA came from someone other than the killer, such as a postal worker or someone who handled the letters after they were mailed. So this DNA evidence is rather weak. Over the decades, numerous individuals have been suggested as possible suspects, ranging from those who were briefly investigated to individuals who remain primary suspects to this day. While a variety of people have fallen under suspicion, none have been definitively proven to be the Zodiac Killer. Of all the suspects, Arthur Leigh Allen stands out as the most extensively investigated, and he remains the closest the authorities have come to naming a prime suspect. Arthur Leigh Allen's name has become synonymous with the Zodiac Killer case, largely due to his unusual behaviour, compelling circumstantial evidence, and the attention of law enforcement. For many, Allen was the Zodiac, and yet despite the extensive investigation, no conclusive physical evidence ever linked him to the crimes. Born in 1933, Arthur Leigh Allen was a Vallejo resident who worked as an elementary school teacher before being fired due to allegations of child molestation. Known to be a socially awkward and volatile individual, Allen's background and personality traits made him an unsettling figure in the Zodiac investigation. In 1969, the same year that the Zodiac committed his first known murders, Allen lived in close proximity to several crime scenes. This geographic link, combined with a series of suspicious actions and circumstantial evidence, would make him a prime suspect for over 2 decades. Allen first came to the attention of law enforcement in 1971 when an acquaintance named Don Chaney approached police, claiming that Allen had spoken of his desire to commit similar crimes. According to Chaney, Allen had talked about the idea of hunting people using the alias Zodiac and sending cryptic letters to the police. This claim, though anecdotal, struck investigators as eerily similar to the Zodiac's actual behaviour. In addition to Chaney's report, Allen's possession of a Zodiac brand wristwatch also raised suspicions. The watch featured the same crosshair symbol used in the Zodiac's letters, which some investigators believed to be too much of a coincidence to ignore. Additionally, his shoe size matched the Zodiac's, and for what it's worth, Michael Mageau, one of the victims, pointed to Allen's photograph when questioned by police. When asked how sure he was, he said pretty sure, and that his attacker had a round face like Allen's. He indicated that he had never been shown Allen's photograph before, indicating that he wouldn't be recalling this photograph from memory. Allen's timeline and whereabouts during key Zodiac attacks further piqued the interest of investigators. He lived near Vallejo, where the Zodiac's first 2 attacks took place, and he frequented Lake Berryessa, the site of the 3rd attack on Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. Allen was also known to own a car similar to the one described by witnesses in several cases. In particular, Allen's presence near Lake Berryessa on the very day of the murders, September 27, 1969, raised red flags. He claimed to have been scuba diving in the area at the time of the attack, a claim that investigators found difficult to verify. Allen's proximity to the crime scene and his questionable alibi only fueled further suspicions. By 1991, the investigation into Allen intensified. A search warrant was executed at his home, where investigators hoped to find evidence linking him to the Zodiac crimes. Although they discovered bomb-making materials, which were consistent with the Zodiac's threats to plant bombs, no direct evidence tying Alan to the Zodiac's murders was found. Authorities also noted that Alan was ambidextrous, a detail that might explain discrepancies between the Zodiac's handwriting and Alan's. Despite Alan's tendency to write with his right hand, some investigators speculated that he could have used his left hand to disguise his handwriting in the Zodiac letters. However, handwriting experts ultimately determined that Alan's writing did not match the Zodiac's, adding another frustrating layer to the case. In addition to the search, Alan voluntarily took a polygraph test in connection with the Zodiac case. He passed the test, further complicating the investigation. However, polygraph tests are not foolproof, and passing the test did little to convince investigators that Alan was innocent. As forensic technology advanced, the Zodiac case saw renewed hope in the form of DNA testing. Investigators were able to extract partial DNA profiles from the Zodiac letters and compared them to samples from Arthur Leigh Allen. The results did not match, leading many to believe that Allen could not be the Zodiac. However, it's important to note that the DNA retrieved from the letters was not conclusive and could have come from someone other than the killer, for example, a postal worker. Arthur Leigh Allen died of a heart attack in 1992, leaving the investigation into his involvement with the Zodiac Killer unresolved. Following his death, many believed that Allen had taken the truth with him to the grave, while others remained convinced that he was simply a convenient suspect who did not fit the full profile of the killer. Despite the lack of definitive proof, Allen remains the most compelling suspect in the Zodiac case. The combination of circumstantial evidence, including his proximity to the crime scenes, his odd behaviour, his possession of a Zodiac brand watch, and the testimony of Don Chaney, has kept his name at the forefront of the investigation for decades. While Arthur Leigh Allen has garnered the most attention in the Zodiac case, several other individuals have been investigated over the years. Some of these suspects present compelling cases, while others have been largely dismissed by law enforcement. Lawrence Kane is another suspect who has drawn attention. He had a history of mental illness, a criminal record that included sexual assault, and a connection to several locations tied to the Zodiac's crimes. In addition to this, Kane reportedly worked near the area where Zodiac victim Darlene Ferrin was employed. Kane's name first surfaced with Kathleen Johns, a woman who claimed to have been abducted by the Zodiac. She identified him as her attacker from a police lineup. She had been driving with her infant child when a man offered to help her fix her car, only to later kidnap her. Johns managed to escape and later identified Kane as her abductor, though his identification remains controversial. In addition, Kane had suffered a brain injury in a car accident that left him with impaired impulse control and behavioural changes, making him a plausible suspect for the erratic and violent behaviour exhibited by the Zodiac. His handwriting was also reported to bear some resemblance to the Zodiac's letters, though like Allen, it was not a definitive match. Despite these factors, no direct evidence ties Kane to the Zodiac murders. More recently, a TikToker has come out alleging that his grandfather, Richard Hoffman, is the Zodiac Killer. This is not a new suspect, and in fact, Richard Hoffman has been a suspect over the last 50 years. Richard Hoffman was a Vallejo police officer at the time of the murders, and he has been described as manipulative and abusive, traits that encapsulate a serial killer. He misspelled the same words as the Zodiac, such as putting a double L in the word until, which also the Zodiac did. Hoffman was a plainclothes police officer who drove an unmarked car, and he was patrolling secluded areas like those where the first two sets of victims were attacked. As a cop, he would have had access to flashlights and firearms similar to those used in the murders. Darlene Ferrin had reportedly told Michael Mageau, who was seated next to her in the car, that the man in the unknown vehicle nearby was named Richard.
He asked Darlene, "Do you know who that is?" And she said something like, "Never mind."
She told him he was a friend of hers and not to worry about it. He was just jealous. That's all she said about it. He was just jealous. She never mentioned his name, but she said something about Richard. I was like, oh, his name was Richard. I kept her name Richard. And I think that was his name. She referred to him as Richard, the Zodiac Killer, the guy. She said he's really a mean temper and that if he ever found out, he would kill her. He would kill her. As she mentioned, she said those words. He would kill me if he ever knew I was talking to you about that. She told me that.
When the man approached their window, shining a flashlight at them, they assumed he was a police officer, so they rolled down their windows to speak to him. After the murder, Richard Hoffman was the first officer to arrive at the scene. There is speculation that he knew Darlene Ferrin personally, and that he was at a painting party that she had hosted. Darlene had previously dated a Vallejo police officer named Buzz Gordon, and apparently he and Richard Hoffman got into an argument just a few weeks before the murder, with Hoffman vowing to get even. But we don't know exactly what this argument was about, and Richard Hoffman denied attending that painting party or even knowing Darlene Ferrin.
Left, we told Hoffman to ride in the ambulance and keep trying to get a statement.
Both of them were put in the ambulance, and I rode the ambulance with them to Kaiser Hospital in Vallejo.
Did you try talking to her?
There's no talking to her. I was there to record anything that would have been said, but I couldn't speak with her. There was an ambulance attendant giving her CPR during the ride to the hospital. And of course her shirt or sweater, whatever she was wearing, was off. And each time that ambulance attendant blew air into her chest, there was a little piece of material from her bra that I could see fluttered with every breath he blew into that girl. This piece of material would flutter on the side. I could see that. We were talking to that girl.
You knew her before the attack, right?
I never laid eyes on her.
You never laid eyes on her before?
No. I'd heard that she was a waitress at an all-night restaurant in Vallejo. But I didn't know the girl at all. Gray Smith wrote a book about the Zodiac, and he mentioned in his book that I was at Darlene and her husband's house on a house painting party prior to her death, and I don't know anything about that. It wasn't me. But that's what he says in his book.
The phone call made to the Vallejo Police Department after the murder came from a payphone just 2 blocks from the police department itself. It occurred at 12:40 a.m. However, Richard Hoffman was at the hospital with Darlene at the time, and her time of death, as stated in the autopsy, is 12:38 a.m. So there is no way that Hoffman could have made that phone call if he was still with Darlene while she was alive. It leaves just 2 minutes between the time of her death and for him to leave the hospital and place that phone call near the police station, which was 2 miles away. And it should be noted that he didn't have his car with him at the time, because he rode with Darlene in the ambulance. And would Hoffman be so brazen as to make a phone call to his work, risking that someone would recognize his voice? Additionally, Mageau described the attacker as having short, curly, light brown hair, and Richard Hoffman had dark, straight hair. Finally, the My Name Is cipher contained 13 symbols. If it is true that the cipher reveals the Zodiac's name, Richard Hoffman wouldn't fit. Though his appearance does resemble that of the Zodiac in the composite sketches, there's no conclusive proof that Richard Hoffman was the killer, and actually many points suggest that he wasn't. There's simply no way he could have made that phone call had he still been with Darlene at 12:38 when she was pronounced dead. But Richard Hoffman wasn't the only suspect named Richard. Perhaps Darlene Ferrin was referring to Richard Gaikowski. He was a journalist and an editor at a San Francisco underground newspaper called Good Times, which operated during the height of the Zodiac murders. Gaikowski's name was first brought to the attention of investigators by a former colleague who believed that he fit the Zodiac's profile, both in terms of personality and location. Gaikowski worked in San Francisco, putting him in close proximity to several of the Zodiac's attacks, particularly the murder of taxi driver Paul Stine. His colleagues described him as intelligent but eccentric, and he often displayed erratic behavior. Gaikowski owned a book that had once belonged to Paul Stine. Potentially, this was a trophy, a common behavior among serial killers to keep belongings from their victims. Disturbingly, both Stine's sister and mother recognized Gaikowski and reported seeing him at Paul's funeral, and this was despite Gaikowski not knowing Paul personally. Gaikowski's connection to another Zodiac victim, Darlene Ferrin, is also eerie. After Darlene moved to New York, Gaikowski followed just days later and even worked in the same building as her husband. When Darlene returned to California, Gaikowski also came back, and this was around the same time Darlene told her family that her stalker had returned from out of state. Ken Narlow, the lead investigator for Napa, claimed Gaikowski was present at Darlene's painting party, a detail that raised red flags. So could this have been the Richard that Darlene had recognized the night she was killed? Nancy Slover, the Vallejo police dispatcher who had spoken with the Zodiac on the phone, claimed that Gaikowski's voice sounded very similar to the one she had heard. In fact, she was sure it was the same voice. But this is dubious, considering she didn't hear Gaikowski's voice until many years later. Additionally, in one of the Zodiac's ciphers, the word Gaik is present. Gaikowski sometimes wrote his name as Dick Gaik, or Gaik with an I, though he never spelled it with a Y. Perhaps he wanted to include his name in the cipher without it being too obvious. The Zodiac did, after all, allude to his identity being revealed in his ciphers. Furthermore, the name Joseph, spelled with an F, is in the same cipher. Gaikowski's middle name was Joseph, and he was of Polish heritage. Joseph in Polish is spelt with an F. Though it's a stretch, if some of the letters in the cipher are put together, it reveals what some believe is the name R. Joseph Gaikowski. However, the ciphers are not word searches, and it's plausible that any word can be found if you pick and choose the right letters. Additionally, the Halloween card written by the Zodiac Killer, the number 3 and 14 are visible. Gaikowski's birthday was March 14th, which is Pi Day, and Pi begins as 3.14. Though these are small details, it's certainly interesting. However, the 14 reference has long been believed to be the Zodiac's body count at the time, with the number increasing with subsequent letters. Despite the intriguing possibility that Gaikowski could have been the Zodiac, his connection to the case is mostly speculative. No physical evidence or compelling motive has been linked to him, and he was never formally charged. Gaikowski died in 2004, and while some investigators still consider him a possible suspect, the lack of hard evidence has kept him on the periphery of the investigation. The Zodiac case has remained unsolved for over 5 decades, and despite the compelling evidence against suspects like Arthur Leigh Allen and others, no one has ever been officially charged with the crimes. Several factors have contributed to the enduring mystery of the Zodiac. The Zodiac left behind little physical evidence that could definitively identify him. Although DNA technology has advanced, the samples obtained from the Zodiac letters have not yielded a definitive match to any suspect. The Zodiac's use of ciphers and misleading letters complicated the investigation. His ability to manipulate law enforcement and the media allowed him to control the narrative and remain elusive. The variety of suspects, each with their own compelling but ultimately inconclusive evidence, has fractured the investigation. This has led to numerous theories about the killer's identity, making it difficult to narrow down the suspect pool. The Zodiac's attack spans several different locations, making it harder for law enforcement agencies to coordinate their investigations. The wide geographical range of the crimes, combined with the time gaps between killings, added layers of complexity to the case. And finally, the Zodiac's behavior and motivations have been the subject of intense psychological analysis, but his true psyche remains an enigma. His ability to manipulate, mislead, and terrorize without being caught suggests a level of cunning and planning that has kept him out of the reach of law enforcement. Profilers have suggested that the Zodiac exhibited several traits common among serial killers. He appeared to thrive on media attention and notoriety, often sending letters to newspapers to taunt law enforcement and the public. His need for recognition and validation suggests a narcissistic personality, a common trait among serial killers. The brutal nature of the Zodiac's attacks, combined with his enjoyment and the psychological games he played with law enforcement and the media, indicates sadistic tendencies. This sadism is evident in his choice of victims, his method of killing, and the way he relished the fear he instilled in the public. The Zodiac's ability to evade capture suggests a high level of intelligence and cunning. His meticulous planning of attacks and manipulation of crime scenes indicate a killer who was not only methodical, but also understood law enforcement tactics. Despite the ongoing efforts of law enforcement, amateur sleuths, and true crime enthusiasts, the Zodiac killer's identity remains a mystery. Arthur Leigh Allen, Lawrence Kane, and other suspects each present a plausible case, but none have been definitively proven to be the killer. The case continues to captivate the public, and with advancements in forensic science, there is hope that one day the Zodiac's true identity will finally be uncovered.